Welcome to our lesson today on population dynamics. And when we talk about population dynamics, what we're talking about is how the population changes, the population of a species changes over time. And if we look at the graph in the picture, in the picture shown, we can see that any population can change over time. If we were to look at the human population, usually what you see is something like this, and then it reaches 1800, and then we see a spike in the human population right around this period, right around 1800. And so the question is often asked, why the spike in the period right around here? Why the spike in the population in millions? Why does it follow that extremely harsh exponential curve? And maybe you can stop the video and have a think about why around 1800 we see this spike. Well, one of the reasons, a couple of reasons why we see this spike in population around this time. A few of the reasons for it were tied in to the Industrial Revolution. So what did we have in the Industrial Revolution? Well, we had far many more factories. We had lots more, far more factories. We had increased modes of transportation. We also had better hygiene. We had much more medicine or access to medicine for the typical normal human being. So the upshot of that is that the population went extremely high. It spiked. And I suppose we're very cognizant and aware of population dynamics at the moment as we make our way through this horrible coronavirus COVID-19 epidemic. And we're used to seeing certain graphs like the one shown here where we're looking at the amount of cases of coronavirus. So we're getting an eyeful of these graphs lately, and we're hearing a lot of people talk about flattening the curve and so on. So population dynamics and population graphs do look at curves, and they look at those things that would alter these curves. So the first thing that we should talk about is this notion of things which affect, natural things which would affect a population size. So if you can look on the screen, we've got a bag here denoting population, and in our bag we have certain things. So if we can view this as being maybe the population of rabbits, let's say. So we have, population of rabbits can get bigger, population of rabbits can get smaller, and various things can impact that. So we can have a couple of things which are really, really important here. So we can have emigration out of this area. So emigration, think E for emigration, E for exit, and that will remove or lessen the population of rabbits in that particular ecosystem. We can have immigration in, I for immigration, I for immigration into the ecosystem, and that would increase the population size. We can also have a thing called natality, the number of births per year. That's definitely going to affect the population size. And of course, the mortality rate, the number of deaths per year, will decrease the population size. So the things in green will increase the population size. They would carry a plus if you were looking at population size per year, and the things in red would bring down the population size. So these are four natural factors for a population that would decide whether these rabbits, whether this rabbit population size gets more or less. There are two different types of populations. There are open populations. A really good example of that would be Canada. It is a situation where the population is affected by those four factors. So I'll just draw Canada really badly here, an outline of Canada. Canada is affected by four of the factors. There is immigration in, there is natality, there is mortality, and there is emigration. and it is affected by all four factors. However, if we look at the Earth, that is an example of a closed population, and it's affected just by births and deaths. In other words, there is no immigration or emigration. That is to say, unless we or until we start figuring out how we're going to get, said astronaut, how we're going to fly them quickly and start populating the moon. Then we might have some emigration out of Earth, but for now, let's just say that Earth is a closed population affected only by natality and mortality. Another thing that we should really talk about here is we should talk about this notion of a biotic potential. Every species has a biotic potential, and it's the ability of a population to increase. And there's a couple of factors that would influence that. There's the birth potential of the species. There is the survival instincts of the species, how well they do in surviving. And there is the procreation. So, how many births are likely from this species. Certain species like rabbits have a very high procreation rate, and they have a very high birth potential. And without certain factors, this birth potential would be extremely large, and it would be enormous for certain species like rabbits. So we've got to think. I've got my hand here reaching towards a birth potential, and there are these things called limiting factors which prevent a species reaching its full biotic potential. Biotic potential would be the potential under perfect natural circumstances, under ideal scenarios, let's say. So limiting factors are that which prevent a species from reaching its full biotic potential. So some example of limiting factors. So limiting factors, remember, will stop a species from reaching its full population potential. So some examples of limiting factors, we can break them up into two. Some examples of limiting factors. Well, there's biotic limiting factors. So examples of biotic limiting factors would be availability or access to food. Whether the species in question has enough access to food will determine just how high their population can grow. The second one here, you've probably guessed it, it is whether there is a virus or disease. We've been seeing a lot of this lately. And the third limiting factor, biotic limiting factor that I'd like to highlight is whether there is much predation or predators in the area. So the predator number. So virus, disease, food, predation, whether that predator number is, quite big, that will determine whether a population of a particular species is growing or can reach a certain potential or not. Some abiotic or non-living limiting factors, of course, that we need to talk about. Well, there are certain abiotic factors. I'm just going to list them here. Well, sunlight for all living things is a very important abiotic limiting factor. The second one, of course, is temperature. Certain species, if temperature goes above a certain level or below a certain level, that will control the population growth. And the third one, of course, is precipitation. So particularly for plants and so on, but for all living creatures that require water, of course, precipitation and access to water is very, very important. So these are examples of limiting factors. They can be categorized as biotic or abiotic, and they would limit a population of species or control how high that population. So when we talk about limiting factors, we also have to talk about something very important called carrying capacity. And carrying capacity is a number. So students sometimes don't realize that it is the maximum number of individuals of species that an ecosystem can support. So when we look at on screen here, we're looking at various factors. And I'm just going to use a pointer here to show those factors. So we have a nice graph, and we're seeing the population is growing. And what's going to happen is it's going to reach a point naturally where it is going to get too high, and then those limiting factors will kick in and the population will drop down. It will increase again, and then it will drop down because of a lack of resources or something, and those natural limiting factors will kick in. And what's happening here is you have this blue line represents a carrying capacity, which in this graph is about 1.6 million. And that carrying capacity for this particular species, it might be, deer or raccoon or ash or oak. That carrying capacity is a breaching point, the maximum number that the ecosystem can support. Now you'll notice that it can go over before it drops down, and this is this concept or notion called overshoot. So the carrying capacity is not the very maximum. It is somewhere in the middle of this boom and bust overshoot that we get. And finally, there are two different types of limiting factors. There's density-dependent factors and density-independent. Density-dependent factors are those factors that affect a population because of the size of population. So, for example, if I have a couple of trees in an area, an ecosystem, certain things like food, competition, and disease. So if we have a little disease that moves in here and attacks the tree, that would be much, much worse if there's a higher population here. That disease can spread. Okay, much, much worse because it can jump from tree to tree to tree. If they're ticks or something like that, they can jump from organism much, much faster when there is a higher population. So these are things that are affected by that population size. Now, there are density-independent factors, and I should also say that density-dependent factors tend to be biotic. Density-independent factors are factors which affect limiting factors that affect a population regardless of size. So these ones tend to be abiotic factors, and ones that I've listed here are flood, fire, habitat. For example, if the temperature goes up and we get a fire which knocks out trees, or we get some flooding here, that's going to affect it regardless of whether there is very few, trees involved or whether there's a lot of trees involved, it's actually going to affect it. So two different types, density independent or density dependent. One, density dependent has to do with the size of the population. Density independent factors do not.